But the fraud triangle represents three things that are usually need to be or about when fraud exists. Okay, so incentive, opportunity, and rationalization. So the rationalization.
Your screen went out again.
My screen went out? Of course it did. Okay. It's like when it. Application sharing is reconnecting. Okay, back?
No.
Okay. Unfortunately, when I have it as full screen, it doesn't tell me when it goes away. Okay. So with the incentive to most people with fraud is money. All right, that's the biggest incentive. Sometimes it's a few other things, but usually it has to do with money. Rationalization, most people can find that they can rationalize themselves into doing almost anything, but a lot of times it's even more than that. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time for stories in this shorter class, but rationalization can include the fact that you believe that you should be able to do something because other people are doing it. That could be a rationalization. You believe that you have the right to take paper from the supply cabinet because you are working so many hours that you should be able to get some other perk. Or you believe that you should be able to use the internet because everybody else uses the internet at work. So a lot of times it's small rationalizations. Other times it's big rationalization, like the reason that you started embezzling from the firm was because you believe that you work just as hard as everybody else, but you're underpaid. So that's rationalization. But there's also other rationalizations. And one of the stories that I tell people with regard to fraud is a fraud that's not on the side of where people usually don't feel sorry for them. There was a lady over in Illinois that it's been probably 20 years now that her husband was sick and she worked at a church. And it was a small church and she was the only one responsible for collecting the money on Monday and taking it to the bank. And so at the beginning, she just started taking some money out of the offerings to pay the bills with the full intent of paying it back. But as her husband kept getting sicker and the bills kept piling up, she wasn't able to pay it back and she kept taking more money. Now, her rationalization was the fact that she was going to pay it back. And she wasn't a mean-spirited person. She was a person that had an incentive right in front of her, the money. She had the opportunity because there was no one else around, and her rationalization was she was going to pay it back. In the end, when they caught her, she had stolen over $25,000. The church didn't press charges. She still worked for the church when I found out about this story about 12 years ago, and she was paying the church back by still working there. But that's not how a lot of these stories work. The key is, at most places, you are never going to get rid of the incentive. You cannot change people rationalizing. The only way that you can stop fraud from happening is to box out this opportunity. For example, if you take churches into consideration, I know the church I go to and my parents' church, 2 people collect the money on Sundays. They count it and they put it in the church office with a dollar amount. And then they have a secretary or somebody who come and then check it, and then somebody else takes it to the bank. So you put a couple different people in there. Now, this lady worked at a very small church, but the 2 people that do it at my parents' church and our church, they're volunteers. So you have to put some level of checks and balances so that this right here can't happen. Because good people do bad things when the incentive is right there and the right opportunity is right there.
I did some of these fraud cases when I was in high school.
Okay.
They're really cool.
Yes. Fraud. I think fraud is really cool. Another quick example down in South County, before my kids started playing sports, is there was a concession stand for where they ended up playing sports for, and the field always flooded, so that might give it away. And so when the field flooded, they joined with another church, and they were holding their summer soccer tournament at this other church. And the deal was that they were going to split the concession stand 50-50 in exchange for them using their soccer fields. Well, the church where they ended up having the soccer tournament had a big, huge brick building and golf carts and all this stuff that the church where they used to didn't have. So at the end of the soccer tournament, the church that hosted it came and gave them the church $1,500. And the guy that was running it said, we were splitting it. And he goes, yeah, this is half. And he just looked flat at him and said, someone's stealing from you. And the guy just looked at him. He goes, we make $3,000 on our little fields with a trailer. There's no way that you didn't make twice this much. So long story short, they looked into it, and the guy that they were paying to run their concession stand was stealing from them. They don't know when he started, but basically at the end of the night, all the volunteers left. This guy was responsible for closing up the concession stand, taking the money, and turning it into the church. They estimated that from that soccer tournament that he probably stole around $4,000. And he didn't think anybody would notice. And they paid him to run it. So he was stealing and getting paid to run it at the same time. So the checks and balances that they put in was now they had two volunteers count the money. Why does my pen stop doing that? 2 volunteers count the money. And then those volunteers called into the church on Monday with a total. And then the new manager that they had running the concession stand took the money on Monday and gave it to the church with a total. And so those two totals better match. So now you have 3 people involved. So these 2 volunteers are both counting and coming up with a total. And then that total better match what that person they're paying did. That way, before that, it was all one person, right? So fraud can get really interesting. So Sarbanes-Oxley came about, and have any of you guys heard of Enron? It's getting harder and harder. All right. Enron basically changed the whole way accounting was done back in 2000 to 2002. It was a large energy company in Texas that, long story very short, they were doing really bad things. It started as not a bad thing, but it became worse and worse, and it only involved very high-level employees. But what happened over time was their stock kept getting better and better and better and better. And a lot of people realized something probably wasn't going right, including their auditors. Their auditors noticed the problem the first month, and they said, you can't do this. It needs to be adjusted. In which Enron said, listen, we're the auditors over your X amount of consulting work. If you make us make this adjustment, we're going to pull all this consulting work from you. Do you really want to be known as the auditors that lost the consulting work for Enron? So the auditors, being really dumb, didn't make them do the adjustment, but said you have to do it next quarter, which of course they didn't do. So now the auditors were at fault also. So it just spiraled, but they were making money, the auditors were making money, and it wasn't until a lady at Enron knew something was wrong and went to the SEC and said something. And then the SEC came in to this room full of a whole bunch of young auditors who were shredding documents, and the whole thing fell apart. And basically, their stock dropped. The company went out of business. It seemed like it went in like 2 weeks, but it was probably over 6 to 8 weeks. Enron had 11,000 plus employees. Arthur Andersen was the name of the company, and that was their auditors. And they went out of business as well. They were an international public accounting firm, one of the big 6 accounting firms. They also went out of business. They basically were, blacklisted out of the accounting industry. And the laws were changed after that, because what they found was that there were a lot of people at Enron that kind of knew something was wrong, but nobody spoke up. And there were a lot of innocent people hurt. The stock in Enron went from its value to zero within 2 days of SEC's filing. And there were people within days of retirement that went from having $1 million in their 401ks to having zero. The lady that went to the SEC had to go into witness protection because people were giving her death threats because they blamed her, not the company and not the auditors. So a lot of new things went into place. One, stiffer fines and prison terms for people that know what's going on. The top level people at Enron, one went to jail, one died, killed himself in jail, one killed himself before he went to jail, and the CEO never went to jail. They could never prove that he was involved because they know how to keep their hands clean. And it's ridiculous. All right. Encourage honesty by having tip lines, whistleblower protections, and ethics code, so that somebody like this woman doesn't fear for her life by calling in tips when they know something is wrong. So these stiffer fines and prison terms, basically next time this Ken Lee, even though they can't link him to the crime, he'll be guilty by association because he should know what's going on in his company. By being the CEO, he should have known what was going on, and next time he'll be guilty by default. And then the big thing that we're going to cover is internal control evaluation within the company. What controls do they have going on inside the company to make sure this stuff is not happening? All right. So internal controls are actions taken inside at every level to try to keep things at an organization safe. All right. We want to try to prevent things before they even happen. Whoops. So we have operations, reporting, compliance. All right. Those are different objectives within. And these are the 5 environments. Now, these don't need to be memorized. All right. But there are different environments within an organization's framework that help analyze the internal control system. And these are the ones that are going to be looked at by that area. They form this pretty little cube. You don't need to memorize it, just to kind of an idea of how things are examined and how they overlap within the different areas. So this is what we want to talk about. So there are 5 internal controls. The first one is establish responsibility. The way to look at this is assign a task to only one employee. Like everybody's has their own responsibility. So for an example, some stores do this. Each cash register is assigned to a cashier. So you know how much is in your drawer at the beginning, you know how much is in your drawer at the end. Not all places do this, but a lot of them do. They check in with their drawer, they check out, and they have to be responsible for what's in that. So establish responsibilities, assigning a task to one individual. Segregation of duties, just a hint, I believe is the most important internal control, and I'll tell you why at the end, is not to make one employee responsible for all parts of the process. All right? So, for example, an inventory buyer, someone who's going out and buying the inventory, cannot approve payments to the supplier. Because if I'm buying and I can approve payments, I could be buying from somebody who might be the highest bidder and I might be getting a kickback, or I could be buying from my friend and that's not necessarily the right way to be buying either. So you want to make sure that you're separating those job responsibilities. Restricting access, we want to make sure that access to assets and information is on an as-needed basis. All right? This includes both physical and logical access. All right? So key access, password access, firewall access, that type of thing. Document procedures. All right? We want to have documents to show what activities have taken place. The best way to talk about this is having pre-numbered checks and digital documents to show that electronic funds have taken place. So being able to show the process of our documents. And then the last one is independent verification, basically checking others' work. Compare the cash balance in one account to the cash balance in the bank or of another account. Independent verification would be what I talked about with the concession stand. The two people who have a balance call it into the office, and then the other person who actually did the managing brings in the cash with the balance, and the person in the office compares. Someone independent is doing the verification. And we're going to do that in just a little bit with a bank reconciliation. So the reason I believe that segregation of duties is the most important is because if you look at all 5 of these, if you do not have a true segregation of duties, then it's not going to matter if employees are assigned to a task. It's not going to matter if you restrict access. It's not going to matter if you have independent verification. If you don't have a segregation of duties between people, then everybody is going to be messed up and be able to mesh their jobs. So you have to be able to have a segregation of duties. Now, it gets really hard to have a segregation of duties when you have a very small company, and that's when it can get tricky. Now, internal controls are limited by 2 things. 1, the benefit has to exceed the cost, and that, again, is when we run into problems with small companies. And just because you find a mistake does not mean it's fraud. All right? Just because you have a mistake, it could literally just be a mistake. All right. So let's look at a couple of our problems.